So good afternoon and welcome to the third in this series of What is the Big Issue? And we welcome Margaret Kamitsuka today from Ohio. She's zoomed in from Ohio, which is very easily done nowadays with technology. I'm going to say a prayer and then Liz is going to introduce her. So the prayer I've been using for this series. Almighty God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. So lead us by your Spirit, that in this life we may live to your glory, and in the life to come enjoy you forever. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who is alive with you and with the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So Liz, do you want to introduce here?
Yeah, so we're very privileged to have Margaret with us today, all the way from Ohio. Margaret is the Francis and Lydia Davis Professor Emeritus at Oberlin College in Ohio. And she's taught all sorts of courses, one of which actually got into an article in Elle magazine in 2016, which was a reason to be hopeful for the next generation, the article. So that was very encouraging. Margaret's written some books about feminist theology and also about abortion and the Christian tradition, and that's why she is exactly the right person to speak to us on that topic today. So welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you on Zoom today, and I look forward to our time together. So my talk is how to think about abortion Christianly. Just a little bit more about myself. Thank you for the introduction. So as you can tell, I'm American, and the college in which I taught was a small liberal arts college, Oberlin College in Ohio, and I taught there for about 20 years in the area of gender and religion. But my training is in Christian theology. But today I will try not to bore you too much with theology talk. So thinking about abortion is like going on a journey in a small boat in very rough waters and navigating between two rocky cliffs. On one side, people claim that it is morally imperative to do whatever one can to protect the right to life of the unborn. And on the other side, there are people who claim that pregnant women have a moral right to decide whether or not to continue with an unplanned or unwanted pregnancy. Now, needless to say, these two positions are mutually exclusive because one can't really protect every fetus until it's born without at some point coercing or even forcing some women who do not want to be pregnant to go ahead and give birth. And one can't really protect a woman's reproductive rights unless you also protect her access to safe, legal, and affordable health care, including an option for terminating a pregnancy. Now, there are commendable motivations to be found on each side, which is why the abortion question is so difficult for people who want to do the right thing. So I'd like to offer my services in helping you navigate these rough waters of these two opposing positions and to reflect together with you on whether there is a Christian position on abortion. So I'll give you a sneak preview of the answer is that unfortunately there's no simple answer. However, there are a number of positions that are, in my opinion, less worthy of being called an ethical Christian position and some that are more worthy. So in order to understand what might be an appropriate Christian position, we need to know how abortion has been talked about and dealt with in the history of the church. And we need to know the factors today that should be taken into account when thinking about abortion Christianly. So let me begin with presenting to you some things that perhaps you didn't know about the church and abortion. Now, current pro-life literature paints a history of the church's supposedly overwhelming condemnation of abortion and univocal view on the sanctity of fetal life. So, for example, British ethicist David Alpert Jones, and the author of the book The Soul of the Embryo, has written this: "The Christian understanding remained unchanged in its essentials from the time of Christ to the mid-20th century, namely, an enduring desire to protect the human embryo." Now, pro-life scholars like Jones trace a litany of anti-abortion statements in the early church. For example, in the Didache, which was a second century Christian handbook, says, you shall not slay the child by abortions. Tertullian, who was an early 3rd century theologian, writes this: since for Christian, murder being once for all forbidden, we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb. And Basil the Great, a 4th century bishop, wrote, the woman who purposely destroys her unborn child is guilty of murder. Now, I could cite many more examples of these kinds of strong statements and condemnation from church leaders and church councils throughout history. But there are a number of scholars, and I agree with them, who suggest that it's more historically accurate to say that overall the church was highly ambivalent about fetal life, and what church leaders meant by these kinds of condemnations of abortion cannot be applied to the context of abortion in our modern world today. So let me share with you 4 points that support the claim that the pro-life reading of church history is misleading and even mistaken. So first, the Bible condemns many types of immorality, but never mentions abortion. Second, the anti-abortion statements were mostly aimed to curtail sexual immorality and cannot be said to give evidence of the church's tender regard for babies in the womb. Third, church leaders were ambivalent about fetuses and found matters having to do with gestation and birth embarrassing or even repugnant. And until the 19th century, an intentional abortion of an early fetus was considered sinful, but not homicide in Roman Catholic canon law and in most secular law. So let me go through each of these points with a little more detail. Now, the first point can't be emphasized enough. The New Testament speaks extensively of many failings and sins and immoral actions, many of them related to sexuality, and many of them associated specifically with women, but no mention of abortion. Now, some pro-life scholars explain this by saying, well, opposition to abortion was simply assumed. But I think it's more likely that abortion is not mentioned in the New Testament because the early Christians inherited their views about marriage and pregnancy from Judaism, and Jewish ethical and legal views on pregnancy and fetal status were fairly explicit. So Jewish views on the fetus are expressed in 2 different kinds of authoritative writings: the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, and rabbinic writings that eventually were codified into a volume of Jewish law from the early 3rd century CE called the Mishnah. So what we think of today as abortion is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible, but there is a specific passage that addresses forced miscarriage. This is in Exodus 21, 22 to 24, which is a legal passage that speaks about the penalties for causing a woman to have a miscarriage. So it says, when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye. So we see articulated here in the book of Exodus the notion that the loss of a fetus would incur a fine rather than the penalty of homicide. The charge of homicide would only apply if the woman died as well. Now, we know more about what the ancient rabbis largely thought about the moral and legal status of a fetus by examining the Jewish legal text, the Mishnah. This text specifically addresses the moral law governing how to proceed if a woman is dying during childbirth because the fetus is stuck in the birth canal. If nothing is done, both will die. And the Mishnah says this: if a woman is having difficulty giving birth, one may dismember the infant in the womb and remove it limb by limb, because her life comes before the fetus's life. Now, the Mishnah is describing here an emergency medical procedure called an embryotomy, which was known to physicians in the ancient world. In this surgery, the fetus is dismembered in order to remove it through the birth canal, which will save the life of the mother. Now, excuse me, until the advent of modern medicine and the development of the cesarean section procedure, this was the only way to save a woman dying from an obstructed birth. This procedure was eventually suppressed in Christianity, which means that until the 20th century, many Christian women died in childbirth because embryotomy was not permitted. Many women still do die today in poor Catholic countries that do not have access to a doctor and to sterile conditions for an emergency C-section. Now, Jewish culture revered family life, and procreation was considered to be a man's duty. The Hebrew Bible has many stories of miraculous births of famous ancient Jewish leaders and prophets. Pro-life writers today like to quote some of these Bible passages as proof that Jews believed in the sacredness of life in the womb. So, for example, in Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. Or in Psalm 139, for it was you who created my being, knit me together in my mother's womb. Already you knew my soul. My body held no secret from you. Rabbis who lived during and shortly after Jesus's day commented on these ancient verses. However, they did not read them as applying to all fetuses, but only to a few chosen leaders and prophets, such as Jeremiah or King David. This was the predominant mindset in the Jewish culture in which Jesus lived and out of which the early church emerged. So in Jesus's day, there were accepted ideas in Judaism that influenced the new religion that became Christianity. In Judaism at that time, abortion was sometimes needed and was permitted to save the woman's life, and fetal life was always thought of as valuable, but not seen as equivalent to the mother's life. Now, my second point, which is that anti-abortion statements were meant to to curtail sexual immorality. Most historians agree that early church writings exhibit a high degree of anti-sexuality views. The church, from its origins, manifested a deep suspicion of sexual activity, even in marriage, and attempted to restrict its use. That is, celibacy was valued over marriage based on Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7:8, where he says, to the unmarried, I say, it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. Now, the church did classify marriage as a morally acceptable choice, but specified that the only licit sex in marriage was to be done with a procreative intention. But even then, it was ranked lower in value to celibacy. And for some early church fathers, even marital sex was sinful, as you can see in this statement by St. Jerome. Not even the blood of martyrdom washes away the defilement of marriage. Now, these obviously hyperbolic anti-sexuality views often took the form of condemnation of non-procreative sex for pleasure, the use of contraception, and abortion. The 4th century ecclesiastical council of Elvira harshly condemned any attempt of married couples to prevent contraception. The church leaders implied that attempting not to conceive during sex was more evil than abortion killing, as we see in this statement by the 4th century Archbishop John Chrysostom, who wrote, indeed, contraception is something worse than murder, and I do not know what to call it, for she does not kill what is formed, but prevents its formation. Now, only very conservative Roman Catholics today would adhere to the church's ban on the use of all artificial contraception. And even those conservative Catholics would probably not agree that preventing a pregnancy is more evil than terminating a pregnancy. So there's ample evidence in the historical church's negative views of women and sexuality, evidence of the church's negative views of women and sexuality. But what did the church think about children? Now, if you were to pick up any pro-life book today, you will probably find quoted this very famous passage from the Gospels where Jesus speaks of children. People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them. And Jesus said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. Pro-life advocates today see a moral and ontological equivalence between born children and fetuses. They take this passage as proof that Jesus would approve of their attempts to save tiny unborn children. However, we have no record of Jesus speaking about infants in the womb, and the early church did not make children a centerpiece of their preaching. When it came to the subject of developing life in the womb, early church leaders tried to avoid that topic as much as possible. Many early church theologians had a visceral abhorrence to the workings of women's uteruses and gestational processes. Tertullian wrote graphically of pregnancy, which he described in this way: "The filth of the generative seeds within the womb, the bodily fluid and the blood, the loathsome curdled lump of flesh which has to be fed for 9 months off this same muck." So no, they did not think of fetal life as pure and the womb as sacred. And remember, until recently, for the Roman Catholic Church, unbaptized, miscarried fetuses or stillbirths could not be given a Christian burial. Now, a fourth reason why it is doubtful that the church held a univocal pro-life viewpoint is that the church did not punish abortion in any uniform way. Abortion, or even an attempted abortion, was always thought to be a sin, mostly because it was associated with non-procreative sex or adultery or fornication. But until the 19th century, an early abortion was never thought to be the same as the crime of killing a born infant. It was a unique and not clearly defined type of women's sin that involved things that the church would rather not speak about, such as women's uteruses and so on. And medieval canon law did not recognize an early abortion as the murder of a person because a fetus was thought to have not yet received its soul until later in pregnancy. It was considered to be a quote-unquote unformed being. One of the first major codifications of Roman Catholic canon law was accomplished by the 12th century ecclesiastical jurist Gratian in his Decretum, which states, "Concerning those who procure an abortion, the question is whether they are to be judged as homicides or not. He who procures an abortion before the soul is infused into the body is not a homicide." So Roman Catholic canon law made any abortion of a formed fetus the ethical equivalent of homicide for the purposes of penance, of penance in the church. But even secular common law continued to view early abortion as an event that could not be characterized as a crime of murder. So we can see how different this situation is from what we have today. For example, most pro-life activism in recent decades in the US has been focused intently on restricting abortion or banning it completely, and even getting it characterized as the crime of murder of a person. The US Supreme Court decision, Dobbs decision on June 24th, 2022, vacated Roe v. Wade, which had protected a woman's right to abortion since 1973. Now in the US, individual states are allowed to pass whatever laws outlying or restricting abortion that they want. And most Republican majority states have done so, prompted by conservative Christian activism, based on the claim that the fetus is an unborn child with an inalienable right to life. In some of these states, no abortion is allowed except to save the life of the mother, but she must be shown to be at the point of severe illness or even imminent death to qualify. And as you can see on this map, the only places in the US where a woman can get adequate abortion health care today is in the states in the teal green color. So, this is a big country, and that's a long way for people to travel if they need abortion health care. Long story short, the church historically has never univocally affirmed the sanctity of life in the womb. Moreover, it has tended not to regard the ending of any early pregnancy as the death of a person. It's fair to say that the church clearly condemned sexual sins and was intent on preventing any use of abortion to cover up the results of adultery, premarital sex, rape, or incest. However, we simply do not have much evidence that the church was trying to protect a fetus's right to life. There is a clear lack of evidence for a strict pro-life position, but is there a Christian basis for a pro-choice position? Now, I think there is, and I think it should have at least two components. So forgive me if I do get a little bit theological here, but I think these points are fairly straightforward. The first component of any Christian position on abortion should affirm that a fetus is valuable in God's eyes. Now, I'm not claiming by this that fetuses are sacred. There is nothing in traditional Christian teaching that anyone is sacred. Theologically speaking, we're all sinners and redeemed by Christ. So redemption does not make anyone sacred. It reconciles one to God. The notion that unborn life is valued by God develops out of a doctrine of creation. So if one holds to the belief that God is the creator and that all that God creates is good, then life is intrinsically good. Now, a pro-life thinker will step in at this point and say, well, therefore, it's immoral to end the life of a developing fetus. But here's the problem with that position. Science tells us that most pregnancies end naturally early in pregnancy. And this does not mean that God deemed these deaths as worthless. Moreover, pregnancy is inherently difficult and dangerous. Even the biblical writers recognize this. There are quite a lot of biblical stories about difficult attempts to get pregnant and about pregnancy being dangerous, painful, and lethal. We are told that Rachel, the wife of Jacob, died giving birth to Benjamin in Genesis chapter 35. So I do not believe that a loving creator God would arrange pregnancy and childbirth to be so difficult and dangerous and then force all pregnant women to go through with it always. So to repeat, any living creature is valued in God's eyes, even those that die before birth. However, as far as I'm aware, God does not require that we protect every living creature in God's good creation, which would be impossible to do. Now, God causes most early pregnancies to fail and has left it up to us to promote what is good for all other pregnancies. A pregnant woman is not called to be a Rachel who sacrifices herself in order to bring every pregnancy to birth. Now, the second component of a Christian pro-choice position follows from the first, and it has to do with the biblical principle of hospitality to one's neighbor. That is, aren't we obligated always to be a Samaritan to the needy person we find along the roadside? And should that Samaritan principle be extended to the needy fetus in the womb? Now, these are very good questions, and the answer is yes, but. So you're all, I'm sure, familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's a busy road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and a man has been attacked and is left wounded on the side of the road. Only one passerby stops to respond, a Samaritan, who puts the wounded man on his donkey and takes him to safety in the inn. Now, pro-life proponents often invoke this parable, arguing that Samaritanism precludes abortion. Pro-life Christians read this story as a fable about how every pregnant woman should be a good Samaritan to her fetus. They believe that this kind of hospitality is the Christian thing to do, even if it is sometimes onerous or risky. Now, I would argue that this pro-life reading of the parable causes us to miss the type of hospitality offered by the Samaritan in the story, which makes it a poor analogy for pregnancy. So yes, the Samaritan stopped, gave generously, and acted self-sacrificially to help the wounded stranger. However, the story does not end with the Samaritan sitting huddled and depleted on the side of the road, exhausted by his efforts to get the man to safety in the inn. Moreover, if one analogizes the wounded man as a vulnerable fetus, then who is enlisted for the labor of actually carrying the wounded man to safety at the inn? Whose body is enlisted for this task? The donkey. The donkey is loaded up with the body of the wounded man. Does the donkey have any choice, any moral agency? No. In the pro-life allegorical reading of the parable, the pregnant woman is not a good Samaritan with moral agency. She is the donkey. Now, I do not think we want to use biblical stories as a means of depicting women as beasts of burden who have no moral agency regarding how they use their bodies to help others, including and especially in pregnancy. Moreover, even in the biblical story, there are limits to what the Samaritan offers. He does not remain with the wounded man at the inn for 9 months and then make sure that all his bodily and emotional needs are taken care of for the next 18 years of his life. In fact, he leaves the next day to continue on his business trip. So let's also be careful not to see this story as an allegory for how adoption can solve the problem of crisis pregnancies. Very few pregnant women would be able to birth a baby, even one that was unplanned, and then relinquish it for adoption. The trauma of that relinquishment can be significant. So in short, this parable cannot function as an analogy for pregnancy and motherhood. Gestational hospitality and motherhood are far more demanding than what the Samaritan did. The parable does, however, function as a teaching about the extravagant goodness of Samaritan hospitality and how that goodness must always be balanced by very practical considerations. So we can almost hear the thoughts going on in the Samaritan's mind. Am I physically and mentally strong enough and prepared to help this wounded man? Do I have enough money? Is there a place or a community who will support me in caring for this wounded stranger? These are very practical and necessary questions for a responsible Samaritan to ask. Now, it may be that the pregnant person finds that she is able to answer yes to all these practical questions, all well and good. She will probably decide to have the baby, even if it was unplanned, and even if she has to scramble to make things work. However, the story seems to imply that if someone feels that they do not have adequate physical, mental, and economic resources, given all their other responsibilities, then it would be foolish to try and take on the huge task of another baby or of becoming a mother for the first time. The story also seems to imply that on that 25-kilometer very busy trade route from Jerusalem to Jericho, the Samaritan must have passed by other needy neighbors. Yet he chose to stop and help this one at this time. He is not condemned for having passed by others, even if he deemed it was not the right time and place to stop and help. So while some Christians read the Samaritan parable as an anti-abortion allegory, I read it as a pro-choice allegory that affirms the goodness of gestational hospitality, but only if the woman is supported in exercising her moral agency to say, no, not now in my life. So let me conclude our little journey between the opposing cliffs of fetal rights and women's reproductive rights. As it turns out, it is possible to make a Christian argument that abortion can be a moral choice. I find that there's also a solid basis in the Christian tradition for valuing life in the womb. But there is also a solid basis for rejecting compulsory birthing every time a woman gets pregnant. There is also a solid basis for seeing pregnancy and motherhood as a kind of bodily hospitality, which women uniquely can give, but should never be forced to give. That is because no fetal life, valuable though it is worth making a woman a beast of burden without her consent. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our time of discussion.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Any questions, comments at the moment? Jane.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was a high school teacher for 30 years and involved in a lot of teenage pregnancies as a pastoral carer. And abortion was often seen as the easy way out. You know, you do it, you get it over with, and it's out the way, and you move on with your life. But it's not as easy as that. It isn't just, you know, like having a tooth out or something like that. There are consequences. There are emotional and physical and psychological consequences to any choice that women make. And it taught me, that 30 years taught me, that there is no one simple answer at all. That anybody who stands firmly on one attitude is unrealistic completely. I've seen girls who've gone on to a 13-year-old who got pregnant, and the mother took the child on, and she just became one of the family. And you know, others who had the child adopted, others who had abortions. Several had abortions, and that affected everybody. The father of the child as well. And it is a very complex issue. And I had you know, lots of friends who were really black and white about the whole thing. I thought, you've never been through this, have you? You've never sat with a family, you know, when they've had to make all of these decisions and choices and problems. And it is a big issue. And thank you for pointing out that, you know, it isn't that straightforward from the Bible either. You know, the Bible does recognize all of the shades of grey that are involved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, I completely agree that we're talking here about shades of gray, and the kinds of situations that you talk about sitting with the family, talking things through, how it's difficult to find, you know, what is the good thing to do. It's very individual in each family situation and so on. But I think what that proves is that there is a proper context for this kind of thing. And the sort of pastoral discussions that you're having is the proper context. The doctor's office is a proper context. The genetic counselor is a proper context. What is not the proper context is a courtroom or legislative bodies. So I think that to really help people make the kinds of decisions that are going to be a difficult decision, that's where it needs to happen, with people who are skilled in pastoral counseling and psychology and so on. So thank you for your comments.
George.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. Just a couple of comments on some of the Bible passages. First, I think I would be cautious about constructing a complete Christian sexual morality on the basis of some of Paul's statements, given that his understanding of the motivation of what he's saying is that the end of time is near, or the return of Christ is about to happen, and that is a very different motivation for what he's trying to put over about sexual abstinence than the situation in the present day. And a second thing, there may be exceptions within Judaism, but I'm not even sure about this. But the status of children, as we find it presented in Mark's Gospel, I think is just as easily understood as saying that children have no status at all. They are like slaves. In fact, in the Greco-Roman world, usually children were assigned to live with slaves and to be brought up and educated by slaves. So they have no rights, no privileges at all until they go through some kind of, bar mitzvah or puberty ritual. So one way of reading the Markan take on things, as he presents Jesus' saying, is that he's saying to be a member of the kingdom of heaven is you've got to give up your rights. So just a couple of comments on those biblical passages. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, George. Yes, I would not recommend that Paul be used as a basis for sexual ethics today. The problem is that in the patristic period, that's precisely what the fathers did. So they did take Paul. They didn't give allowances like, oh, well, Paul was speaking in an apocalyptic, a fashion. They took him at his word. And that's what sort of formed the basis for the anti-sexuality views that distinguished Christianity, for example, from Judaism. I mean, the Jewish community was kind of gobstruck by the direction in which Christianity moved, which was so counter to their view of marriage and family. So yes, we have to understand that the context of that Paul was speaking. And yeah, that's a very interesting point that you make about Jesus talking about, well, we should all give up rights in some ways. That's what in some ways redemption is that you're giving yourself over, to Christ. That in some ways is what the metaphor of the children, could have been pointing to. That's not though how pro-life writers use those passages. They use those in order to make actual ontological claims between born children and unborn. Yeah.
Jezza.
I am an anti-abortionist. I'm pro-life. I once saw a film of a morning's work in a Canadian abortion clinic, and it changed any views I had. The babies cried. They were put in bins. It was a horrendous thing, and it's been with me all my life, really. So I've never been in the position when I've needed to consider an abortion. So I'm very grateful for that. But it's just simple. I'm an anti-abortionist and can't change after seeing that film. Horrendous.
Yeah, I don't know what that film is. And I really can't get into the all of the rhetoric and the use of imagery that certain pro-life groups use. Some of these are, I'm sorry to say, are fabricated. And indeed, any medical.
This one wasn't. This film was not.
Oh, that may be, but because I don't know the name of it, I can't comment on what that film was, when it was made, what the procedure was, but
it's a murky business, and we have to answer to God at the end of it all.
Yes, this is
wonderful.
Yeah, this is the issue is, and that's why I bring up this example of the embryotomy procedure. This is a gruesome procedure. I mean, they call it late term abortion, which is not actually a medical term, but it is a life-saving procedure. It's the only way to save a woman's life if she has an obstructed birth. And if you go to any, not even Catholic majority countries, but any country where there is lack of a medical care, this is the only procedure, and it is still done to save a woman's life. And this was not permitted to be done under under Catholic canon law. It would be considered a direct abortion, and as a result, archaeologists have found countless and countless graves of women with fetuses lodged in their abdominal cavity, which was the death of an obstructed birth. This is we have to keep the reality that pregnancy and birthing are very dangerous for women. And so it's true that an abortion procedure, particularly, and it sounds like the one that you're describing, might have been a late term abortion if there was, I don't know how there would have been crying. I can't imagine that. But that these are gruesome procedures. And this goes back to the point that Jane brought up earlier, that this is gray area, but you have to think about, yes, we live in a world where we have to make sometimes very difficult choices. But are we going to take away the ability of a woman to decide what she wants to do with her body and with her pregnancy? Not that choice is ever going to be easy, but that she should be given the chance to make the choice. So that's the only claim that I'm trying to make here. Not that it's easy, that it's not sometimes gruesome and difficult and so on. That's the only way I can respond to what you shared with us.
Okay.
It's good to hear the arguments for pro-life, because if you go to evangelical, the arguments for pro-choice, because going to an evangelical church, you tend not to hear those arguments. So, certainly in the past, when I've been a junior doctor, I've been asked to get involved with terminations, and because it's been a grey area for myself, I have done them, but afterwards I kind of felt a bit guilty as well. But yeah, it's definitely good to hear the arguments both ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick, for sharing that. I appreciate it.
So I think we draw to a close. Thank you very much indeed, Margaret, for flying in from Ohio to speak to us. Really appreciate the issues you've raised for us and the questions you've left with us, and the discussion of particularly of the grey area and where that might be. So thank you very much indeed. Next week, we're going to hear from Dr. Anne Richards, the National Public Policy Advisor for the Church of England, on deliverance. Are there any evil spirits? So do join us next week for that one if you can. Otherwise, we might see you in 2 weeks' time. But thank you for joining us today.